This video covers the cardiovascular side of Unit 2 now, so we're now on the second half of the unit, and it covers the very first topic, which is the structure and function of arteries and capillaries and veins, so the three types of blood vessel. So there's two parts to this. There's one about exchange of substances at capillary networks, which will be the next video, and then there's this one, which will be the blood vessels one. So generally what you'll need to know first of all are the three types of blood vessel and how the blood flows from them. So in terms of generally blood flow, it begins at the heart, and then it will pass from the heart into arteries, then into capillaries, then it will drain into veins, and then these will return to the heart again. In terms of pressure from this, what you'll need to know is that the arteries are at the highest pressure because the blood's been forced out of the heart at really, really high pressure there. And then it will decrease as it passes through capillaries, and then will decrease further when it passes into veins. So veins will be at the lowest pressure. So for example, the vena cava, which is the biggest vein that drains back into the heart, will have the lowest pressure of all the blood vessels because it's draining into the heart. So in terms of arteries then, that's the first one we're going to talk about with the highest pressure. They will carry blood away from the heart. Now, in terms of National 5 knowledge, this is still applicable. So you still need to know that they have a narrow central channel, and you need to know that they have a muscular layer, which is thicker than the veins. But you'll now need to know that in a bit more detail. So that central channel we talked about initially in National 5, which is this gap here where the blood flows through, is now called the lumen. Okay, so that is just a narrow channel that the blood flows through. Now in different blood vessels that'll be different widths, but for the arteries these are very narrow. Now around that lumen you have a layer of cells here, which is actually just one cell thick. Now that layer of cells is called the endothelium. Now the endo means in, right? Thelium is a lining, so it is a single layer of cells. And those single layer cells will reduce friction. And that friction can occur between the blood that flows through that vessel in that lumen and then the wall of the artery. So it reduces friction between the blood and the walls. And when it does that, that allows the blood to flow more smoothly. The next layer working from the inside out, on top of the endothelium, would then be your muscular layer. Now in arteries, it's not just muscle that's in this layer. I'll come on to what's in it next. But initially, your muscular tissue will be involved in a couple of things. So with any muscle, it can contract. And when the muscle contracts in this layer, it narrows this lumen. And that process is called vasoconstriction. Now vaso means blood vessel, constrict means to narrow, to tighten. So when you vasoconstrict your blood vessels, the lumen narrows. Okay, so that involves contraction of that muscle. And this is important because it controls blood flow. Now specifically, if the lumen narrows, that will decrease blood flow and will reduce the amount of blood or the volume of blood getting to whatever area that blood vessel supplies. It decreases blood flow. Okay, so vasoconstriction narrows the lumen due to contraction of the muscle. Vasodilation will do the opposite then. So vasodilation will widen the lumen. Now vasodilation occurs when you do the opposite of contraction. your muscles relax in that artery. And when the muscles relax and that lumen widens, it will then increase that blood flow, allow more blood flow in. So if you look at the lumen of an artery that is vasoconstricting, it's got a really narrow lumen. But a lumen of an artery that is vasodilating, way wider. So see the difference between these two. This is constricting because it's narrower. This is dilating because it's wider. So in this one, there's less space for the blood to flow through. Therefore, less blood gets to wherever it's supposed to be going. And the same with this one. If there's more blood, more space for blood flow, because that widening of the lumen allows that, then blood flow will then increase to that area. So in this layer, as well as muscular tissue, you also have another type of tissue. And these are fibers specifically made up of elastic or elastic type tissue. So elastic fibers, similar, they do similar to what an elastic band would do. So elastic fibers will stretch. Okay, so they'll stretch open, and then once they ping back, that's called recoiling. So they will stretch and recoil. And the reason this heart needs to stretch and recoil is because every time there's a pulse, that surge of blood from the heart, it needs to be able to accommodate that. So elastic fibers stretch and recoil to accommodate the surge of blood from the heart. Okay, which is otherwise known as a pulse. Okay, so that accommodates that pulse when that blood is forced out of the heart. Now the last layer that I've not labelled yet is this layer out here. And that's the very outside layer which kind of holds the whole thing together. So this is made up of connective tissue and elastic fibres. Now you only need to be able to label this part, you don't need to be able to know anything about it really. Okay, so done arteries now. What I'm then going to do is move on to the next one that the blood flows into, which would be capillaries, which would be a slightly lower pressure than this artery. So this here is some diagrams of arteries. So I'm going to give you a bit of detail first. So obviously they're lower pressure than the arteries that we talked about before, and they will connect arteries to veins. Right? And they form networks, so they branch off and they form really, really branched networks that supply tissues. And they supply tissues with a whole range of materials. Now because they're so branched, and because they are so large in network ways, they have a very large surface area. And the reason you want a large surface area for this is to increase the efficiency of what they're doing. So the more space they have for it, the better it works. So to increase efficiency for substance exchange. Now those substances could be things like oxygen or carbon dioxide or glucose or anything like that. Anything where you would want stuff to transfer from the cells to the blood or from the blood to the cells. So if you look at the structure of a capillary, this is actually far more zoomed in than this one over here, like the artery. This is much, much larger. Okay, this is actually microscopic now. So we're far more zoomed in than we would be for the arteries and the veins. Now, just like the artery, you have a lumen, okay, which is just that area for that blood to flow through. Now that lumen, compared to the artery can fit a lot of blood through it. The lumen is very narrow, to the point where it can only fit one red blood cell through at a time. So it's only about the width of a red blood cell. Okay, so that's microscopic. Now the other layer, which all the other blood vessels have as well, is this endothelium. Now And notice it's only one cell thick. Okay, so that is one cell across in that lining. Now, the reason it's so thin is so that it allows diffusion of substances and materials to move across it really quickly. And it also has tiny gaps between these cells. So anytime you see a cell connecting, there will be tiny gaps. Now those gaps allow it to be what's called permeable. Now hopefully you remember that term permeable or permeability from National 5 when we talked about semi-permeable or selectively permeable membrane. So that allows substances to move through. Now when I say move through, I mean move out of the blood that's in there in the plasma and out of the lumen and then across that wall. Now this is the front section of the tube, okay, which is the capillary, but what I've done is I've actually sectioned it off along here on this diagram. So in this you can see that it's only the width of one red blood cell, which is what's shown here. You can see the endothelium here, which is that one layer, that single layer of cells. And then you can see a white blood cell here. You'll know it's a white blood cell because it's got a nucleus, whereas the red blood cells don't. And then in here, around about that would be the plasma, which is the liquid part of your blood. So these are two views of the same thing. Okay, so capillaries are done. So once those capillaries have finished substance exchange and things have moved from the blood into the cells or vice versa, the blood then drains into veins. And this is where your blood is at its lowest pressure. So that blood that's in its lowest pressure is wanting to go back to the heart because it's also lost a whole bunch of materials that it would normally want to then go and pick up again, like oxygen, for example. Okay. So it returns blood to the heart. Now veins in terms of their structure are very similar to arteries. So capillaries are kind of the odd one out because they're much smaller and they miss a lot of layers out. So veins are very similar to arteries. So this then therefore would be your lumen. Now if I pull the artery diagram back, the lumen is far narrower in an artery than it is in a vein. The veins is much wider. Okay, so this is wider than an artery. Okay, but it still allows blood to pass through. Then we have the next layer, which is the endothelium. And again, the function of that is exactly the same as in the arteries. Okay, so endothelium, single layer of cells, reduces friction. So it's the same idea with this vein. Now, next layer out is your muscular tissue. Now you'll notice again, I'm going to keep jumping back here, the muscular tissue in the vein is much thinner than the one in the artery. The artery's got much thicker walls. Okay, so muscular tissue is thinner than arteries. You'll also notice that I'm not adding any elastic fibres to this layer because that vein does not need to accommodate a pulse. And then the final layer is just the same as the arteries now. So it's the connective tissue and then some elastic fibres as well, just for general movement. Okay, they don't need as much elastic fibres as that artery because they don't have to accommodate a pulse. Now, the last thing that veins have is what I've drawn in these diagrams here, which is valves. Now again, this is a National 5 point that's still applicable to you, that you still need to know this. And valves, if you remember from National 5, prevent the backflow of blood. Now I'm going to show you what I mean by that, because right now here, this is a valve. These wee kind of essentially flaps of skin, or flaps of tissue. And in this vein right here, we have a valve that is open. And what happens is that blood flows through that nice and easily when there is movement of the blood. Now, when that blood stops moving for whatever reason, okay, or maybe in between a pulse, or although that's not in an artery, it might be in between the beats of the heart, or it may be just the fact that it's not moving as much. That blood then tends to try and fall by gravity. And when it falls by gravity, it would flow backwards. So these valves then would slam shut and prevent that blood from flowing backwards. Okay, so that would be your valve in the closed position, which would stop blood flowing backwards. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to do the next one, which is the substance exchange at capillary networks.